Good morning, everyone. My name is Yesenia Sikcho, and we're here today to talk about organizational diversity. Thank you, sir, for the warm welcome. I hope you all enjoyed the video as you came in. That video was Michael Jackson, 1991, was the year that video was released. That year was the year that my family and I moved to the United States from Mexico. So I remember watching that video and being really nervous because I did not understand the words. And it was a culture shock for me. But it allowed me to embrace the beauty of America and its diversity. And TMD is no different. So how do we maintain that diverse force within TMD? So I have a couple definitions for you. First off, diversity. What is it? What does it mean? Diversity is a cultural climate which allows people to maximize their potential by embracing each other's characteristics, age, religion, and race, etc. Another definition is inclusion. Inclusion is valuing and leveraging individual differences for organizational success. Inclusion is involvement and empowerment when hard work and dignity of each guardsman is recognized. So a little bit of history of diversity. So back in 1917 and 1918 were the last 2 years of World War I. That was the year that females were allowed to enter the military. They were spies, and they also served as supporting MOSs. In 1948, President Truman passed an executive order where he made it illegal to have discrimination in the armed forces. In 1994, during the Clinton administration, we had the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which was rescinded in 2011 with the Obama administration, and that was a huge success for the LGBTQ community. Fast forward to 2016, we now have females serving in combat arms. Those are positions that were historically filled by males. So we have come a long way, and being transparent is great, but we need to do more, and that's why we're here today. And we will explain to you why diversity is important.
My name is Craig Moore from Houston, Texas, and I'm going to talk a little bit this morning about why diversity is so important, not just in the Texas Military Department, but in society overall. It's an uncomfortable subject. It's not something that people really face with a lot of comfort. So you may find yourself a little bit uncomfortable throughout the brief today. But don't worry, we're going to give a big Barney hug at the end. It's all going to turn out just fine. So the tag asks us to look at the diversity within the department. Specifically, at the recruitment level, we look a lot like Texas. But once we get to the middle management, the E5, E6, or the O4 on the officer side, that diversity that Texas has starts to change in the department. So why is that? Is there a glass ceiling somewhere? Are we discriminating in some ways against minorities that keeps them from rising to those levels? So that's what we looked at. One of the things we did was we went to a diversity conference. And if you didn't know, diversity it has a whole industry. And the industry has a focused message, a message that they want you to see only the focused part, very much like a commercial would on television, where they don't want to show you everything about the product. They only want to show you parts of the product that make you want to buy it. And it's a very similar thing. And so they'll tell you some stories about why diversity is important. And so I'm going to tell one of those stories this morning. And it has to do with the Chevy Nova. So in the early 70s, Chevy developed this car. They called it the Nova. The problem is Nova in Spanish means no go or not going. So the diversity industry will tell you that you probably shouldn't name a car that says that it doesn't go. So if they only had diversity on their team when they were coming up with the name of the car, then it would have sold much better in countries where they speak Spanish. What's the problem with that? It is true that Nova in Spanish means not going or no go, but it's not entirely true. So in order to illustrate why, I'm going to tell you my own little story that I made up. So I'm driving down the road one day and I spill coffee on the floorboard of my car. And now I need to replace the carpet. So I go to Yesenia and I say, hey Yesenia, I spilled coffee on my carpet. I'm going to need to buy new carpet. And she says, why do you want a trunk monkey? Does that make sense to anybody? That makes zero sense to anybody. The reason is because in her mind she heard car pet, not carpet. And the only car pet she knows of is a trunk monkey, because it's from commercials in the Utah area for a car dealer of a monkey that was in the trunk of a car that you hit a button, and if you're involved in road rage, the monkey would get out and beat the guy that's raging against you. So I was stationed in Salt Lake City for about 4 years, and that dealer is in the Salt Lake area. It was a thing. It was funny. But, you know, so in order for Nova to be confused with no-go or not going, it's two words in Spanish. So no one made that connection. The car sold very well in Mexico, sold very well in Venezuela. So the story that they tell isn't entirely true. In fact, anyone heard of Pemex? It's a oil and gas company in Mexico. It's owned by the Mexican government, actually. And they have a brand of gas called Nova. It's been there forever. So it took me about 30 seconds with my Google machine to figure out that the credibility of what they're telling me at this diversity conference isn't entirely true. Does that mean that everything they tell me is not entirely true? No, it doesn't. They do good work. But like anything, you got to drill down to exactly what you're looking at and what the facts are in order to understand exactly what they're trying to tell you and how to solve your own problem. What about the business case for diversity? Because they will tell you that any business, if you have a diverse leadership group, that you'll perform better. And we're not a for-profit business. However, we are a business or an organization that wants to be excellent, and we want to do as best we can to complete the missions that we're given. So this article comes from Forbes, and what it's going to say, the headline is it catches your eye. Racially diverse companies outperform industry norms by 35%. That's fantastic. I'm a numbers guy. I see 35% outperform, I'm happy. But my question is, what is industry norms? What does that mean? What are the industry norms that they're talking about? So I read the article. And what it tells me is that 366 public companies analyzed, those that are in the top quartile for diversity in their leadership group are 35% more likely to have financial returns above national industry medians. That statement is vastly different than the headline. It's not outperforming. You have a 35% greater chance of outperforming than or being above the national industry median. Well, what does median mean? Equal number of instances above, equal number of instances below. So that tells me just by existing, you have a 50% chance of outperforming the industry median. Is that what they're trying to say? Absolutely not. That is not what they're trying to say. What they're trying to say is that when you have good diversity, that means that your team is cohesive enough and it will work well enough together that you should be able to outperform. Is diversity the reason? They don't know. In my opinion, the reason for that doesn't necessarily have to do as much with diversity, but it has to do with the decency of the folks that are in the leadership group. A couple months ago, Dove put out a commercial. Some in the room may have seen it or heard about it. It hit social media and in a very negative way. This picture is all over social media because it's a soap commercial where 8 young ladies they're wearing 2 shirts. They pull off the top shirt to reveal the next girl in line. And the young African American girl pulls off her shirt to reveal a white redheaded female. So is the message that the African American needs to wash herself with Dove soap to become more white? That was what the complaint was on social media. That is absolutely not what Dove was saying. In fact, what's interesting, the video that you watched when you came in, at the very end it had people changing. So it was different races of people because the name of the song was Black or White. It doesn't matter. We're all the same. We're all the same people. And coincidentally, Michael Jackson in his video had a young African American female that changed into a white redheaded female. It's the exact same situation. Excuse me. So is Michael Jackson trying to say that? Absolutely not. The point Dove is trying to make is that we're all the same. But the bias that exists out there in society on what diversity is will communicate, that will communicate to those folks that, hey, you're being racist here. And so we need to be aware of that, not only in how we deal with society at large, but how we deal with our own members from a leadership perspective. One thing they won't tell you is the one that the girl that followed white girl was a Latina. That doesn't fit in the message. Like I said before, they're focusing the message on what they want to get a response right out of you. And so they don't want to tell you that part. There were 8 of them in total, all of different races and all of different ethnic backgrounds. So let me ask you a question. When I put up the picture of the trunk monkey, how many in the room, by raise of hands, saw something racial in that? Anyone? No one? Seriously? Colonel did. Why? Why do we... Do you think that I think that a monkey represents a racial group? I can tell you that's absolutely not the case. But society tells me that I should think that way because it could be offensive to some folks, to an entire group of people. So I put that up there intentionally to kind of make this point that we have to understand those kind of biases. And Kim today is going to talk to us about unconscious bias. She's also going to talk about logistics branch being awesome. Everyone knows it's the Air Guard, all right? So anyway, she's going to talk about unconscious bias. So that could be an unconscious bias that I have, or it could be an unconscious bias that whoever I'm communicating to also has, and they are in conflict. So, and that's the same kind of thing that Dove was doing. They had no idea that this would be any kind of racial message, but it was, and they had to pull their advertising down and apologize. In my opinion, diversity isn't our strength, but decency is our strength. So what do we do in the department to combat any kind of connotations that we discriminate in any way? When we have hiring boards, we ensure that there's a diverse member on the board. If there's a female meeting the board, we ensure that there's a female on the board. It's by regulation. That's what we do. Does it change the board results if we didn't have those aspects? In my opinion, probably not. But what does it do? It communicates to the people meeting the board a certain level of comfort that their race or ethnic background is not going to be discriminated against here. Why? Because it's the decent thing to do. That's the right thing to do. That's what decent people do. So we're going to hit you with a bunch of numbers this morning. That's why diversity is important. But Pam's going to come on out. She's going to talk a lot of numbers and exactly what we look like as far as our racial makeup in the department.
Thanks. Good morning. Good morning. So I have the most exciting part of this presentation, guidance and numbers. Woo! So guidance. We're not here because y'all got an email this morning saying to be here. We're here because there's an executive order from our Commander-in-Chief that says you will support diversity and inclusion. We also have strategic plans. National Guard has a strategic plan. It was published in June of this year. Do y'all know who's on the cover of that strategic plan? Our TAG and our senior enlisted advisor. So that's a heck of a reason to be here today as well, right? We also had some leadership that was involved in some impactful roles in the military. Brigadier General Noriega was a member back in 2011 that authored a report from the Military Leadership Diversity Commission. This report went to the President and Congress. That influence in that report led to military and combat roles today. So that's another heck of a reason to be here. We also have EEO and DOD policies and DOME website for our command climate surveys we have to do, right? So all these policies, that's why we're here, right? So data, the other exciting subject. There's tons of data, oh my gosh. So when we first started this project, I'm like, JDEC, what? JDEC, the Joint Diversity Executive Council, chaired now by our very own General Farrell here in the front row. It's a heck of a reason to be here. Thank you. Oh, that was that as of. They'll be meeting soon if they follow our recommendations at the end. But the JDEC has a ton of data. I saw pie charts and bar graphs and everything about diversity issues and where we are. So we have the JDEC. We have recruiting and retention data. So if anyone in the room is from the recruiting shop, we want to recruit folks that look like Texas. We do a great job of that. You'll see some data here in a minute, but do a phenomenal job of that. And they use metrics and data to make sure they're accomplishing those goals. We have EEO offices we talked about. I was at a pre-command course for brigade and battalion commanders. Army Contracting Command's the best. But it's a 4-star command. We spent over 2 hours listening to diversity subjects in that classroom to make sure we're doing the best and to be in line with all those policies we talked about. So now it gets really exciting. Let's talk some numbers actual. So, National Guard Strategic Plan, we want to retain the diverse talent that is reflective of the communities we support. So do we do that in Texas? Do a pretty good job. So in Texas, the population is 75% white. We're at 79%. Black is 12% population in Texas. We're at 16. Some good diversity there. Asians, 4 across the board. But the Hispanic population, we have 39% of the Texas population is a Hispanic ethnicity. Mind you, that's also reflected in the white race demographic. They're 2 different categories. So Texas is 39%. The Army National Guard is at 26%. So there's a little bit of a delta. So let's take that a step further. Let's go to San Antonio, right down the road. San Antonio, white population 77%, we're at 83%. Black population, 7%, we in the Texas Army National Guard are at 12%. Asians, 2% across the board. But here's the one to think about. The ethnic population and Hispanic population in San Antonio is 63%. That's a lot. We only have 32%. So that's something to be concerned about, and that's part of the reason why we're here today. The other part of the reason why we're here today is to keep you awake. So the next task I have for you, if you are, is it State Guard row E? If you're in row E, I want you to stay seated. On this side of the room only. Everybody else, it's the first time I'll get to tell a couple of generals to do something. Please stand up. So this section and forward, stay seated. I have a wrangler over there, so she's trying to help guide. So this section and forward, stay seated. See, this is a test to see if y'all were awake. So look around the room. You are the privates and the PFCs that are newly assessed into the Texas Army National Guard. You make up 60% of our new enlisted population. Okay, so next, Simon says, take your seats. Now, let's go 10 years into your career. What does that look like? So those of you that were seated, your turn to stand up. You are now the staff sergeants, the E6s, the senior airmen and above that represents that diversity that we're looking for. Where'd it go? That table just turned. So you can take your seats now. Thank you. So the drill we just did is reflected on the slide in front of you. Categories in blue was the 60% on the enlisted side. But as you see, a waterfall effect. As you start coming up on that mid-career time frame, the diversity numbers go down. We're trying to figure out why. The one caveat I have to this is women officers. Somehow women officers have stayed the course. From 01 to 06, and we have a couple GOs in the front row. So they have broken the mold, but female enlisted goes down, everybody else goes down. So we cracked the code on one of them. So keep this chart in mind as we go forward through the rest of our presentation and think about how do we fix this waterfall effect. With that being said, we went and did some research, and our next speaker is going to discuss that with y'all.
I'm going to talk about surveys, but before I get to surveys, I don't know how this turned into a branch war, but I saw engineers coming in here, and I'm pretty sure we could take them. Pretty sure we could take them. So we did surveys. Kind of the idea here was we were trying to see if all the strategic guidance matriculated down into the units. Everybody loves online surveys, right? Although we got some good respondents. I mean, I'm not going to lie to you, but it was nowhere near the bulk of stuff that we needed to get to put data together to do this type of thing. Thankfully, a hurricane named Harvey hit, and it allowed us to take some. And I think that's the only time you'll ever hear anybody thank Hurricane Harvey. But we took some time to talk to senior leaders. We took some time to go do some personal interviews. And although most of the senior leaders, at least 50% of them, said, hey, in my time coming up through the military, which for some of y'all was like 40 years ago, Colonel Cheney, they felt some, good old boy system, as some of us old timers have, good old boy system, and they felt that some of the minority leaders had to work a little bit harder than the standard person to get their due diligence. And Kim's going to talk about that a little bit later. That's some more overt type of discrimination, and she's going to do a good job, a whole thing on that. But when we start talking about specifics, 0.0 of the respondents said that they felt that their unit, the higher strategic levels, organizational levels, had any type of policies or any implementation that they were discriminated against. So if that's the case, then why are we losing people? And I'm going to tell you, what the data tells me through all of this stuff is the reason that minorities leave, the reason that anybody leaves, is exactly the same reason. So we don't have a discrimination problem. What's the problem? To look at it, you have to go all the way back to when people join. So from the state of Texas, every year, annually, 14 to 18,000 young people graduating from high school join the active component, whether it be the Marines, Navy, Air Force, whatever. And I say that to say this: what do we have left? We have the people that aren't looking for a full-time military career that's going to take them all the way to the end. They have a goal in mind. I had a goal in mind when I joined the National Guard. I wanted to graduate with a master's degree, blah, blah, blah. Everybody has something. That's why you join the National Guard. The problem with that is that there's a pinnacle. What we're looking at is 6 to 10 years in the Army where you're a junior leader fixing to move into a senior leader, E5s, E6s, captains moving to major. That is the same time that these young men and women are reaching their goals. If you join to go to college 6 years in, hey, you graduated college. I did what I needed to do. The Army did what they needed to do. Appreciate, see you later. I'm gone. Or you're starting a family. Typically, you're talking about 30 years old, 32 years old, starting a family. You're talking about your commissioned officers that have gone through ROTC. They're getting to the point that they're starting to get senior in their jobs. And especially when you're talking minorities, over the last 25 years, we've seen in the civilian sector that their opportunities are just exploding. So if you have the opportunity to go somewhere and make a lot of money or continue in a thing that you were planning on not doing in the first place, why are you going to stay here? So 20% of the respondents have family and work conflicts. And I don't know what we're going to do to fix that, but that's where that lays. The next set of respondents, 30%, cited lack of career progression. Also included in that number, and a lot of write-ins, and this is both the enlisted folks, the officers, and the senior leaders, all cited transformation in there as lack of career progression. We already know all the typical answers, SSD, low density MOS, whatever it is, but transformation kind of struck me as odd. So I talked to a young man out of the Houston area, and we as leaders have this mantra of transparency, of managing expectations, but sometimes we fail to realize that transformation has been happening since 2006. This young man I talked to, he had no less than 4 MOSs since he joined the Army in 2006, 2 deployments, and his unit has been 3 different things in the same location. 30% of our folks, and almost all of them, cited transformation in one shape or form. Next category, and the final category, the elephant in the room, literally and figuratively, APFT. And again, non-attributional. I'm not saying minorities fail APFTs more than anybody else does, because that's absolutely not the case. Because it is a standard thing, 50% across the board. Now, when we first looked at this, we're going to do our interviews, we take our list, and we say, hey, we're going to take these top, whatever it is, off, because they're all flagged. We know that that's the reason that they're getting out of the Army. They can no longer meet our standards and they need to get out. That sounds great. But the reality is when I started doing these interviews and when the rest of us started doing these interviews and talking to people and they cited lack of career progression or my family has needs, and then we went back and we researched why is this specific person not able to progress in their career. And then we look and they haven't taken a PT test in 3 years. They haven't taken a height and weight for 3 years. They may not be flagged, but the APFT is still a reason, and that bumped that percentage up from about 30% to 50%. And that kind of leads into other things because I thought to myself, okay, so again with Kim's presentation, which she's going to talk about here in a minute, unconscious bias. So all these folks that we know haven't taken a PT test or they've failed a PT test, is there a reason, is there a discriminatory reason that these folks weren't flagged while these ones were? And again, that's not what the data told me. What the data told me is some units are good and some units suck. And that's just what it is. So the bottom line, we don't have a discrimination issue in the Texas Military Forces, and focusing specifically on the Air Guard and the Army Guard. What do we have? We have a leadership issue and we have a retention issue. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to Kim, because she's going to talk about unconscious bias and hopefully solve the world's issues.
Hi. So good morning. My name is Kimberly Baird, and I'm going to talk to you today about unconscious bias and the potential impact that it has on leader advancement in our organization. So we all know, we've probably seen policies that are in place currently today that prohibit sexual harassment, prejudice, racism, and discrimination. But we know that policies don't necessarily result in automatic change, especially when we're trying to change an organizational culture, and even more so when those policies don't necessarily align with an individual's personal belief systems, right? So what we're seeing is we've evolved from the overt discrimination and the overt behaviors to more implicit behaviors, is what we're referring to as unconscious bias. So before I go down the path of unconscious bias, and we're going to leave him up on the screen because he's cute and fuzzy looking, I'm going to talk about leader advancement in our organization. So at the E1 through E5 level, advancement is based off of more objective criteria, right? So objective criteria is unbiased. You have your advance based off of your mil ed requirements, your time and grade requirements. You meet APFT, height and weight standards. But then as you move up the chain from E5 and above, now you have the evaluation report, right? So the evaluation report includes a subjective assessment. And subjective assessments by nature are going to be biased because they involve a personal assessment from your rater and your senior rater. So let's talk about how our organization. So this is if a assessment is biased, you can see how potentially unconscious or conscious bias can impact your advancement in an organization, especially as you're going up the chain in a hierarchical organization. So what this represents here, this is a hierarchical organization such as the Texas Military Department, and to the left and the right you have arrows that increase. One's subjective, one's competitive. And we can argue that in a competitive environment, or the more competitive the environment, the more your subjective assessment is weighed. And so which one do you think is more important, your objective or your subjective? Well, in a competitive environment, your subjective assessment is going to weigh more because your positions are going to kind of taper off. You're going to have more potential candidates that are qualified that meet that objective criteria. And so through our board processes and the processes that we have in place that progress our leaders, especially up into those higher positions, you're going to have bias. And it's natural. So we're going to talk about conscious and unconscious bias. So conscious bias are prejudices against or for a thing, person, or group, and they're usually compared to another, and they're usually considered unfair. So you have this monster here on the slide. He's our conscious bias. He's ugly, he's bad, he's loud, He's a nasty guy. We see him, we want to kill him, we don't like him, right? Now, our unconscious bias, on the other hand, is cute. He's warm, he's fuzzy, he's cuddly, we want to pick him up, we want to squeeze him. And he's silent, right? So our unconscious biases are social stereotypes about certain people that we develop outside of our conscious awareness. So what's interesting is that we have these beliefs that we come up with that are influenced by all the different factors in our external environment. These are our individual belief systems. And we tend to come up with these unconscious biases based off of our tendency to want to categorize those social identity groups. And we don't realize it, but 70 to 90% of our daily decisions are made unconsciously. So an example, let's use the corporate America as an example. So 14% of American men are over 6 foot tall. Yet 60% of corporate CEOs are over 6 foot tall. 4% of American men are 6'2" and over. Yet 36% of corporate CEOs are over 6'2". So could be coincidence, but what we think is that somewhere along the line, unconscious bias created a perception that maybe gave those taller men an advantage in corporate America. So another interesting point about unconscious bias is it's usually incompatible with our own personal views, our own conscious awareness, right? I'm not prejudiced, I'm not racist, I don't believe in all that. But when we start to look at maybe who do we trust the most, who's in our circle, who do we tend to gravitate towards, who do we want to be around? So let's use Kim as an example. She's a leader in her notional organization of mostly black female officers. She has unconscious bias. And these are the attributes that contribute to her unconscious bias. So she's a female. She thinks females are rock stars. She graduated from Marist College, so anybody who graduated from Marist College, she holds in high regards. She's black with a Caribbean background, so anybody who shares that background, the food, the music, the culture, she will gravitate towards, she wants to be around them. She's married with young children, so she sympathizes with people that with women that have children and that are married. She thinks the LG branch is the best branch.
Oh, yes.
Okay, well, bias is bad, bias is bad. And anybody who's airborne, especially those that served in an airborne unit, she thinks are awesome. They're in her in circle. And left-handed people are intellectually superior than right-handed people. So she goes throughout her time, and she's building her team, right? And so unconsciously, she selects people that are like her, have similar interests, similar backgrounds, a lot of commonalities. So what happens is her team is cohesive. There's an immediate sense of trust because everyone's alike, right? They all share the same beliefs, attitudes. Maybe they hang out together on the weekends. And their decision-making is also alike. And what also is alike is their unconscious bias. So in a hierarchical organization, if you maybe add another row below the mini-Kims as a subordinate row, and maybe even another subordinate row, you may find this happening more often than not. So what happens when we add in a minority soldier? So Kim's excited. She supports all of the organization's diversity programs. They align with her own personal beliefs. She welcomes the new soldier to the team. She's excited. She's excited to have a diverse member on her team. But because of the cohesiveness and the trust that she tends to gravitate towards those individuals that are like her and have those commonalities, he kind of naturally becomes a little isolated. So, and because he's different, he has some different ideas, he has some different views, he has some things he wants to implement, but his ideas are kind of ignored. They disagree with him all the time, and so he's kind of off to the corner, right? So all the dotted lines there, they represent communication, relationships, guidance, mentorship. And so what do you think happens to him on his performance evaluation? Do you think that those limited top blocks, he's even in consideration? Do you think that his comments may be a little biased on his evaluation? What about promotion or advancement? Do you think that he would be considered for those limited promotion slots, or even in those limited positions for advanced schooling? Well, he has his unconscious bias too. And he shows up to the team, he thinks women are weak, and he thinks women are weak, and he thinks left-handed people do everything backwards. They can't possibly produce any intellectual work. So he kind of comes in with a little chip on his shoulder. He knows he's not really part of the circle, but he's hopeful, and he tries to integrate, he tries to bring up his ideas. But because he's still kind of off to the side, and he's never really in the circle, his performance suffers, his attitude changes, and so he kind of set himself up for failure in a way. So he may have deserved a little bit of what he got on his evaluation, but from a leadership standpoint, did Kim and her colleagues and his colleagues do everything that they could have done to include him as a minority in their circle? Did they embrace his diversity and the value that it added to the team? So I know this comes across as a little overly simplified example, but unconscious bias gives us a possible answer to the question as to why. Why is it that our minority leaders may not be advancing through the ranks? And how do we fix unconscious bias? Well, we fix it by bringing it to the conscious. So we talk about it, we're reflective, we do training, which we're going to talk about, recommendations. But we want to turn that little cute fuzzy guy, we want to rip off the fur, rip it off, bring it open, have it turn into that ugly monster, the ugly conscious monster, conscious bias monster, so that we have a target to engage on. Okay? So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Yesenia, who's going to talk our final recommendations. Thank you.
I just want to say the AG branch is the best branch. Hua. So how do we maintain our diverse force? We've identified the three areas of improvement: leadership emphasis, retention, and unconscious bias. So we recommend that we develop a new TMD strategic plan that is nested with NGB's plan. This plan needs to be displayed in our TMD public website so everybody has access to it. And we need to leverage that website to provide more information to our MDay force, our airmen, and also our state guard and civilians. A lot of times we constantly hear, well, I don't have access to it, I can't log in. Let's use our public website for that unclassified information that we can share. Also for retention, we can create a new retention policy that basically focuses and ensures that leaders counsel the soldiers on career management and counsel the soldiers for retaining qualified soldiers and airmen. Enforcing the counseling will ensure the success and maintain the strength of our organization. And we can also identify what are the issues causing the soldier or airman to leave the organization. Do they need a break because of civilian work, or do they need a break due to family? Maybe offer an alternative to separation. Instead of being discharged, let's use the ING program. Hey, go away for a year, maintain communication with that soldier, and then bring them back once their situation gets cleared. So focusing on retention is key. And then lastly, the unconscious bias training. We already have several programs in place, like the OIC and CIC course. The HRO has the tech supervisor course. We need to implement diversity and inclusion training to include unconscious bias in any opportunity that we can. We also encourage that leaders take the Harvard Implicit Survey It's a quick 10-minute video. If you think that you don't have unconscious bias, you can go ahead and find that video, take the test, and you'll find out the results on that. So our ultimate goal as a TMD is to have a TMD that fosters and builds a positive work environment where all individuals have equal access to resources, information, and opportunities that allow them to continue to contribute their individual strengths to TMD. So we challenge each and every one of you to the pursuit of greatness through diversity and inclusion through Duty, Honor, Texas. Thank you.